Hi everyone, it's John. Welcome back to my channel. It is June 9th, 2021, a Wednesday, and I have another book review for you. Like every Wednesday. This book is by an author I've always seen and heard of for years, and actually own a couple of other books by, but had never read anything by before. I think this book was published under a couple of different titles, depending on where it was published, but my edition is called The Conquest of America, and it is by a writer by the name of Tzvetan Todorov. He is he passed away, a Bulgarian-French writer. And I will talk about a little bit more about what he wrote about. This, I think he wrote was this originally in La Conquête de l'Amérique? Okay, so originally in French. I know some things he wrote in other languages too, and then those were subsequently translated into English. But this is obviously an English translation. Over the course of his career, Todorov wrote a small library, just a lot of books on a wide variety of subjects, from intellectual history to sociology and literature. One of the sort of through lines of a lot of his books is a unique attention to the field of semiotics, which is the study of the way signs and symbols interact with one another and how they can create, especially on larger terms like culture and civilization, and how they can create complex webs of meaning for people who see them, and especially for people who interact within those webs. Specifically, many of Todorov's books look at how people who have widely divergent operating assumptions about the world interact with one another. And this is one of those books. And it really, it's a fascinating book. It's short, and it's, right at 240 pages or so. And it is not difficult, but it's very, very heavy reading to think about, because we usually don't think semiologically. It's not something that comes naturally for most people. So it's he's sort of dragging you through new ways of thinking about how minds would have encountered minds that were completely alien and foreign to theirs. In The Conquest of America, sometimes subtitled, like I said, The Question of the Other, he brings a microscope to the individual and cultural interactions that happen in the immediate aftermath of the Spaniard Hernan Cortez's interaction with the Aztec Empire. It should have said, complete destruction of, right? He very directly precipitated the complete massacre of the Aztec people. At the core of the book, Todorov challenges the reader to get to know the Aztecs on their own cultural terms, and at the same time to critically examine the dominant European terms, norms, and ideas that the author would probably argue we have inevitably culturally inherited through legal codes, literature, philosophy, storytelling, etc. Todorov's methods of getting to know the Aztecs vary widely, but focus on acute readings of contemporaneous events, such as the groundbreaking ethnographic work of Bernardino de Sahagún and his his book that he wrote called Historia General de las Casas de Nueva España, and other historical accounts, contemporary encyclopedias, diary entries, letters. While admitting to the important roles played by the superiority of the Spanish military and Spanish weapons, and diseases which Aztecs had no immunological response to, Todorov claims that Cortes had a, quote, comparative semiotic advantage over Montezuma. While Cortes's actions were driven by the exigencies of human-to-human communication, Todorov says that Montezuma's communications were spread over a wider field of supernatural spirits and dream interpretation, and thus, quote, by his mastery of signs, Cortes ensured his control over the ancient Mexican Empire. So what are some of the differing ways in which Europeans and Aztecs saw the world that would lead to their disastrous encounter and eventually the complete destruction of the Aztec Empire? Todorov opens the book by describing Columbus's strategy of interpretation as one that is almost pious in its certitude. Instead of Columbus being confident that he will find land, he knows that he will find it. This leads him to misidentify birds and floating branches, despite Columbus's own prodigious knowledge of natural history and the natural world. Once he, quote, discovers the islands he's looking for, he immediately renames them in an attempt to give them the right names. Columbus's approach to the world is pragmatic, obviously colonialist, and hierarchical. While neither vision of looking at the world is necessarily right or wrong, this approach has primed both him and subsequent explorers, by him I mean Columbus, and subsequent European explorers, for a demeanor of acquisitiveness and possession. Obviously ties into the whole colonial thing again. While Europeans have a linear notion of history, and here's another thing that is sort of interesting about, again, world views, right? World building. The Aztecs have a view of history that's circular. Aztecs have a goal of history to become part and parcel with fate. Instead of trying to, like the Europeans will, like the Spaniards will, trying to impart their own unique impression on historical events, right? The European is trying to become famous, is trying to discover something, is trying to make a name for him or herself, where the Aztecs want to submit to a sort of universal will. They have interestingly, a very sort of stoic sense of fate and destiny. The Aztecs live in what Todorov claims is a world that is overdetermined and overinterpreted by government bureaucrats, whereas Europeans confer worth upon individual people. The Aztec world stage sees important events playing out at the level of the social, not the individual. This is why, as Todorov argues, we see Aztecs willing to go to their sacrificial deaths. They are eager to play out their role, even if that role is being a blood sacrifice for the whole of society. And these are just a few examples that are given throughout the book that give a good sense of the kinds of arguments that are being made and whether whether you might find them compelling as a reader as to whether his thesis makes sense. Todorov's book is full of claims that have kept generations bickering, a couple of generations bickering over his conclusions. This book was written in the 80s sometime. The consensus positions regarding why the Aztecs were killed so quickly and easily For example, that the Europeans had better military technology. Montezuma was cripplingly indecisive. Factionalism among the Aztecs are all convincing in and of themselves. But especially when two completely different worldviews collide, like we have here, we get the feeling that something much more fundamental and rudimentary might be at work as to why things really played out the way they did. If anything, Todorov's thesis that the Spaniards used their assumptions about themselves and about the other, with a capital O, to gaslight and manipulate the Aztecs, which he certainly did in their diplomatic relations with them, remains one compelling suggestion to explain the highly asymmetrical outcome, to say the least, of this clash of two cultures. Probably, by the way, also one of his better known works in the English-speaking world. Sometimes you see it assigned in university courses. The Conquest of America, sometimes with the subtitle, let me find it, The Question of the Other. Quite a fascinating book. Any comments, questions, concerns, please leave them down below, and I will see you next week with the next installment of the Princeton University Press Book Haul. Until then, bye.